Okay, Patrick, could you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on your activities in Alaska in the field of health?
I certainly can, Robert. My name is Patrick Anderson, and I am myself Alaska Native. I come from two different tribes. So, in my culture, being matrilineal, we claim our mother's tribe as our predominant tribe. So, I am Tlingit Indian, and I come from the Eagle moiety, and one of the clans in the Eagle moiety is mine, the Shunkokedi or Thunderbird. So I was born in Alaska, ended up living in Seattle for a number of years. Fortunate in some ways, unfortunate in others, but that background led me to an undergraduate degree at Princeton University and a law degree at the University of Michigan. So when I returned to the state of Alaska, um, I came back listening to my mother's voice, which is that after you've finished all of that, you really should go back to Alaska and help Alaska Native people. So that's what I did, and here I am about 50 years later.
Hmm. And we talked about a number of things, and one of them was where to begin, because in our group at City University of New York, Hunter College, we were talking about environment and climate change. And you brought up health issues involving toxic stress and other matters that impact Native Alaskans disproportionately. Can you introduce us to that concept and what you meant by that and how it fits into the bigger picture of environment?
I sure can, Robert. Later in my career, um, I began to think that law was not really the field I wanted to be in. And the first position that I was hired to was a compactor, which is Alaska Native organization that operates a contract with the United States government to administer healthcare within a certain region. During my tenure at that first job, I came across a study that to me explained a lot of the issues that Alaska Natives have faced. So, my mother attended a Catholic boarding school for her primary school and went to a Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school for high school. That was framed in a different way after I became familiar with the adverse childhood experience study and later on the whole world of toxic, tolerable, and normal stress. I'm not trained as a psychologist. I wasn't really into biology, chemistry, but since discovering the adverse childhood experience study, I have related it to a number of root causes of problems and issues that not only Alaska Natives, but non natives have faced, particularly in Alaska. And so, in the world of toxic stress, behind me is the village of Kivalina with about 400 people. And within that community, a very high number of residents will have significant amounts of experience that could qualify them to be a regular sufferer of toxic stress. And there are a lot of neurobiological and physical and chemical reactions to the stress response that I won't go into. But what it does is it affects normal day to day living for all people. So when we were talking about climate change, if that was an empty peninsula behind me, there's no problem or issues. Nature tears land up constantly, but when you put people onto it, it not only changes the dynamics based on location, based on the kind of weather that hits it, but it changes dynamics because there are now people there who have lives, and their lives are impacted and affected by what happens to them. If they're used to it, if it's normal, that is a different response than if it is unusual and out of the ordinary. So, toxic stress has been a huge part of my thinking in terms of the root causes of a lot of problems that strike Alaska over the past half a century, or actually more than a century.
And what are the challenges that Native Alaskans in a village like Kivalina face specifically?
Well, the first is that the largest community next to Kivalina is Kotzebue. Kotzebue has about 3,000, 3,200 people living in it. That's not a real large community. It's rural by US standards, but it is the regional hub. And so, in order to get to Kivalina, which has no roads, you need to fly from Kotzebue or from Anchorage. There's a 3,000-foot runway on the peninsula that Kivalina is located on. So any airplane that goes in has to be able to land on a gravel runway of about 3,000 feet in length in sometimes very challenging weather. In addition to that, you can see that it's surrounded by water, but wells don't work there. So they get their water source from another source, bring in raw water into a huge tank. I think it's a 7,000, 8,000 gallon tank in Kivalina. And from there, they have to purify it. And from that point, I don't believe all of the homes are connected. And in order to get water, sometimes you have to drive to, not in a vehicle necessarily, but you have to have water picked up and delivered to your home. Same thing is true with fuel. The Chukchi Sea and that area around Kivalina is covered in ice for a lot of the winter. And as a result, there aren't any barges coming in with fuel. So there are some huge fuel tanks that carry all of the fuel supply for the community for the entire year. And they fill it maybe once a year. They have to have the money to be able to do that. And in addition, they have to have good weather, and they have to schedule the barge in order to be able to come in, plus the financing that comes in. And then the infamous honey bucket, that was in some places still used, but people don't have sewer systems. So they have to take their raw sewage and take it to a lagoon. And the challenges, of course, for food is that by the time an apple gets from Washington State to Kivalina, it's not very appetizing or appealing. And as a result, a lot of Western diet, which has been introduced into many of our communities, is very expensive. Milk can cost $10, $11, $12 a gallon. Fuel can cost $7, $8, $9 a gallon. And because the average temperature in this area during January is about 15 degrees below zero, you use a lot of fuel. So there are a lot of challenges that exist within a small community like Kivalina, created by its remoteness, by its lack of infrastructure, and by lack of good paying jobs, having the ability to survive there in a very high cost environment. Multiple challenges, and that's in addition to the health challenges that exist. Just having a child can be very complicated in a village like Kivalina. So when a pregnant female is within a certain period of time for delivery, she is taken to Kotzebue, where she spends 3, 4, 5, or 6 weeks, depending on the seriousness of the pregnancy, waiting for the child to be born. If it's a high risk pregnancy, then it's into Anchorage, where they will wait for the same period of time.
Wow. So I think of the word empathy. And some of us in the lower 48, we think climate change is a large issue that we can't really get our heads around, and it seems to be more of a political issue sometimes. But here in Kivalina, we have a different perspective. What would you like people to understand in terms of empathy for the people there?
First of all, the people in Kivalina and in the Northwest Arctic are extremely hardy. They have survived and thrived in an environment where most people wouldn't even consider living. And they've done it by extensive use of local resources. So in the area around the Kivalina, the local people still harvest whale. They don't get very many whale. One of the problems that's occurred is that as the pack ice is retreated in the Northwest Arctic, It's taken away the ability of whale hunters to get out to where the migratory paths are. But traditionally, a whale or two would be harvested and would provide a lot of food for the community. Walruses, caribou, whitefish, and then in addition to that, a great deal of trade. So there's an extensive trade network of individuals all over the Northwest Arctic and the North Slope who, when they get foods that they have unique access to, will trade. So there's a great deal of hardiness and survival. But when a traditionally nomadic people were located in one central area, it was to have access to education and to services like healthcare. The brutal truth about Native life back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is that there was a lot of disease, a lot of health issues. And so providing healthcare services in a remote area like this is challenging. Kivalina has a community health aid clinic where they do evaluations of routine types of problems and issues, but then individuals who have more serious problems will go into either Kotzebue or into Anchorage for medical treatment. Weather hampers that quite a bit, and there are severe weather patterns that exist up here. The same pack ice that I talked about that has been retreating also protects this peninsula from the worst ravages of winter storms. The pack ice itself absorbs a lot of the impacts, a lot of the water doesn't then wash up onto the very fragile peninsula. On top of that, the warming climate is melting the permafrost. So when that permafrost is no longer there, the soil is it's more difficult to protect. So in all the pictures that you see of Kivalina, there are a lot of rocks around it. The rocks are there to try to protect the soil that exists. And then the migratory patterns and the fish, they live in a certain temperature, they return at a certain time of the year, and when the climate starts to shift, you find that those migratory patterns shift. It may be more expensive to get out to where the resources are. I mentioned fuel can cost $8, $9, $10 a gallon, and you don't go by miles per gallon in a small boat. You go by gallons per hour, and when you're spending a few $100s to try to get out to a place to harvest something, the cost becomes sometimes prohibitive. Same is true with bullets. Bullets have been very expensive in the Northwest Arctic for quite some time now. So all of these challenges come together and add to the stress that a community is experiencing. And that interaction, that systems interaction between people, their food sources, climate, the place that they live is just, it can become overwhelming at times.
Can you give me a snapshot of what kinds of health impacts you began to see when you were working in these villages, and both as an attorney and as a healthcare provider?
Yes, it was puzzling to me why Alaska Natives had higher rates of autoimmune diseases, higher rates of cancer, higher rates of diabetes. A lot of the transmissible diseases ran rampant. A lot of upper respiratory diseases and issues. So when you are in a place that has substandard housing, air exchanges aren't as frequent, mold becomes a problem, and the average household size is fairly high, and it's a small, close-knit community. So if some kind of transmissible disease comes in, like a flu, it can move through the community very quickly. So something like the COVID virus can move through very crowded places very quickly. And we did have that experience in Western Alaska. And so a lot of villages did shut down. But it was puzzling why a lot of these other issues existed. And one of the points made, the scientific points made by the adverse childhood experience study is that toxic stress can take a significant amount of time off of an average lifespan. So, in the adverse childhood experience study, they studied 10 different experiences that children have. If you accumulated 6 or more of those, what the data said is that you have your cohort has on average a 20, almost 20 years shorter lifespan than people who have none of those 10 experiences. And as I began to look at why that happened, what the root causes were, it turns out that a lot of the stress chemicals that stay in your body for longer periods of time actually ravage your body. So it explains a lot of the autoimmune diseases. Arthritis was a huge problem in much of Alaska. But when you look at the stress chemicals, the inflammation that stays in your body as a toxically stressed adult, it starts to explain a little bit of the reason why some of these things happen. With cancers, smoking is something that gives people relief from stress. And so we have a very high rate of smoking within our communities. And then we also had in other parts of Alaska a lot of smoked foods, so smoked salmon. People would have wood stoves in their homes. So you get introduced to a lot of different pollutants as well. So one physician that I worked with years and years ago told me that the physicians at the Alaska Native Medical Center were probably among the most experienced in stomach cancers because they had a very high rate of stomach cancer among Alaska Natives back in the 90s and 2000s. So now those are a few of the reasons, Robert, that I believe that the health impacts are a little bit more severe in Indian country and Alaska Native country than they are for the rest of the country. Not to minimize that we do have problems in all of our areas.
Well, when we talked in our pre-interview yesterday, we went through a lot of these topics, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's a lot on the table here to discuss. And one of them, to backtrack, is the historic relationship between tribes and the United States government, the Russian government, colonizing forces, if you will. And I was surprised to learn that, however well-intentioned, when, let's say, a school or a church is built, it reflects a kind of tie down to a place or location or architecture that was basically imposed from the outside, whereas many of these cultures may have been highly nomadic. Do you want to comment about that? I was thinking of the impacts of that too, you know, that not just the stresses of the place, but you have, you know, with the boarding schools in Canada, we have 750 bodies being found in a field, which has shaken up, you know, the tribal entities of Canada and the political infrastructure, and is a reckoning in a certain way that all might not have been fair.
That's an understated way of saying it. You're absolutely right.
Well, I'm a writer, so
that
we want
shows
to
through, Robert.
lead people into the topic in a way. So.
Yes, absolutely. It's called a leading question in law. We are prohibited from doing that, but we find ways of bringing that back in, and I appreciate that. Historical trauma has always been around. It is the treatment and infliction of certain behaviors by a dominant culture on a subdominant culture. But what was interesting about Alaska is that when the Russians came to Alaska, they claimed it under Western European law, but they did actually have very little territory that they had any control over. So initially, very small parcels in Kodiak, a little bit in Sitka, a couple of forts that were heavily defended was all the contact they had, and they were here predominantly for the sea otter, and they harvested a lot of sea otter. They created a great deal of devastation among the Aleut hunters because the Aleut hunters were very prolific at being able to capture sea otters. And so there's a lot of historical novels that are based on somewhat factual accuracy that talk about the intensely brutal treatment that Russians inflicted upon Aleuts in order to get them to hunt. And then when the Treaty of Cession came and Russia gave up its rights to Alaska, there were very few places that had any governmental structure. So what happened is that churches started to come in and began dividing up Alaska. So we ended up with a number of churches: Presbyterians, Catholic, um, Evangelical Mission Covenant Church, Russian Orthodox, and each trying to impose their own will upon a culture that had developed over tens of thousands of years their own way of doing things. And so we ended up with cultural suppression. In Cake, one of the communities that I'm familiar with, um, a lot of the historical um, artifacts, we call them atu, they're really a cultural part of our ceremonies, was burned because of religious beliefs. Alaska Natives were not allowed to become citizens in the 1920s until they gave up their savage ways, and they had to have at least 5 white people attest to them giving up their savage ways. Boarding schools. A number of my friends and colleagues tell me about how they were prevented from speaking their language, how they were punished physically for doing that, and of course separated by long distance from their families, sometimes for 4, 5, 6, 8, 9 years. Boarding schools went all the way down to Oklahoma, which is where my uncle went for, great uncle went for a little while. And so a lot of things began happening that started with this historically imposed trauma, but has now morphed into intergenerational trauma transmitted from grandparent to parent to children. And we're now starting to understand the extent to which that has impacted Alaska Native cultures. So when you look at the diffusion of things like alcohol abuse, it is higher in populations that have higher numbers of these adverse childhood experiences. When you look at drug abuse, one of the statistics that absolutely blew me away is that if you are a young male between the ages of about 18 and 34, and you have 6 adverse experiences, you're about 4,200% more likely to become an IV drug user later in life than someone who has 0. So there's an explanation for a lot of these things that happen, but the long and the short of it is that when you have accumulated through this childhood acquired experience a level of toxic stress, your body is constantly trying to adjust. So we have among this population of high toxically stressed individuals higher rates of crime, higher rates of addiction, higher rates of physical abuse, sexual violence, great deals of anger, and trying to deal with that at the same time as you have these issues of adult acquired trauma. And when you have a huge storm and you're sitting in a place like Kivalina, winds are blowing 60, 80 miles an hour, and you're wondering what's going to happen to the foundation of your home if it's sitting right there on the shoreline, that stays with you day in and day out and contributes to those health issues, to that shorter lifespan. There's very little joy to be found when you have high levels of toxic stress.